Hello, I'm Joseph Noor. I'm a medical doctor and a biochemist, and I'm the author of Document X, Direct Evidence of God's Existence. Today I want to discuss evolution. Now, why evolution? Well, there are two pivotal reasons for this. One is there is still a great deal of misconception about the subject, and the primary reasons for this are fraudulent misrepresentation, false propaganda. Evolution is portrayed as a godless philosophy, opposed to God, opposed to morality. And then the third reason is blatant ignorance. For example, the belief that apes somehow miraculously transform into humans. The second reason I want to discuss evolution is that 90% of Muslims dismisses the idea of evolution, and these include scholars. Now I want to provide some clarification and clear up some of the main misunderstandings. So basically there are two opposing models which attempt to describe the method of creation. The one is based on the literal interpretation of the book of Genesis in the Bible, and it's called scientific creationism or creationist science. Now, according to this understanding, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, depending on which sources you consult, God gave the command, and everything, including stars, planets, galaxies, all living things, including, of course, the first human couple, came into existence in a very short time. And then there's the idea called evolution, which proposes that creation happened in stages over extended time intervals. I must mention that there are some biblical scholars which dismiss the idea of the literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, and they embrace the evolutionary concept. Now I'm going to look at evolution first, then analyze the Quranic perspective, and then give a discussion on scientific creationism. Now, evolution in a general sense means change in living things over generations. Now, over a few generations, changes are imperceptible because evolution happens over vast spans of time, and human lifespans can only be measured in terms of decades. So we cannot see the changes associated with evolution. But fortunately, there is a recorded history in the form of fossils, bone fragments, stone tools, and a library of information in our cells, which speak clearly about the evidence supporting change over geological time. It's rather like the aging process. I can't see the changes associated with aging over a day because aging is too slow. But I can look at the recorded history, at the photo album, and realize that the person has passed through many stages. Now, if you observe the natural world, you find there's an endless variety of living things. But on closer examination, there's a hierarchical arrangement. At the lower end of the spectrum, you find the primitive creatures such as worms, jellyfish, and in the middle part of the spectrum, there's the more developed insects, amphibians, and on the upper end of the spectrum are the sophisticated mammals. Now, we can determine at what stage in the history of life these animals appeared by using radioactive dating techniques. And we can do this by analyzing the fossilized remains of these animals. Now, let me just digress for a moment. Fossils are the preserved remains of long-time extinct animals. They give us precious information about the structure, the behavior, the nature, and even the environment that the animal lived in. So it's a window to our prehistoric past. If you look at the Earth crust, it's divided into layers called geological layers, and we can date these layers using the same dating techniques applied to fossils. And you find that the deepest layers are the oldest layers, and the middle layers have an intermediate age, and the upper layer is the youngest. Now, fossils are not randomly distributed in the Earth's crust, and as expected, you find the old primitive creatures confined to the lower deep old layers. The more developed creatures such as insects, amphibians occupy the middle section of the Earth's crust. And at the top, you find the recently evolved bigger-brained mammals. And right at the surface are the fossilized remains of humans. Now, according to evolution, life began in an ancient form, in simple form, such as fish. And some of those fish develop into amphibians. And some of the amphibians transform into reptiles. And a specific a reptilian stock transformed into mammals, and a specific mammalian line that gave rise to the primates, which is the common ancestor of man and the great apes. The question is, where do fish come from? Now, to answer this question, we have to look at the origin of life. Now, evolution doesn't deal with the origin of life. Evolution is about explaining complexity, how simple life forms develop or evolve into more complex life forms. But most scientists, however, agree that life began in a non-living form from the non-living chemicals of the Earth's crust, and there was a gradual chemical build-up, and eventually the molecules of life appeared, and they were enclosed in units called cells. About 600 million years ago, these cells combined, forming the first multicellular creatures. And some of them evolved into marine invertebrates, and others to fish, and some of the fish evolved into amphibians into reptiles, and so on, as I explained earlier. Now, if evolution is true, there should be transitional forms. In other words, specimens revealing a combination of features of a particular ancestor descendant, indicative of species transformation. And in the last few decades, scientists have uncovered a series of fossils, true transitional forms of fish evolving limbs, dinosaurs sprouting wings, and reptiles evolving mammalian-type features. The question is, why did these changes come about? What triggered these changes? Why did some fish evolve into amphibians and some amphibians into reptiles? And the answer lies most of the time in the environment. Now let me just give you an example. About 400 million years ago, a particular fish flourished called lungfish. About 10 million years later, that is 390 million years ago, there was a drastic change in climate. The climate became dry, water sources dwindled, threatening the very existence of these fish. And in response, they evolved limbs and a kind of a primitive lung, which allowed them to crawl out of the water and breathe the air. Now, at that time, this is very important, at that time, there were no land animals. So, about 30 million years later, that is 370 million years ago, there was an abundant form of life on land, four-footed vertebrates called tetrapods inhabiting the land. The most plausible explanation for this was that these vertebrates evolved from those fish crawling out of the waters. And if that is so, there should be a link between those fish leaving the waters and the four-footed vertebrates enjoying a terrestrial lifestyle. In other words, what they predict is that there should be a transitional form, that this actually happened. And this transitional form should appear at the right time. That is, later than 390 million years ago, but earlier than 370 million years ago. And lo and behold, such a creature was discovered and was labeled Tiktaalik. And this creature revealed a link between those early fish and the later tetrapods. Looking at this creature was a true transitional form, and it was a stunning verification of the theory of evolution. Although it was fish-like, in other words, it had scales, fins, and gills, it also revealed amphibian-like features. It had a flat head with eyes on top of the head. It had sturdy ribs, which meant it could breathe the air, possessing limbs which could only be described as half fin, half leg, and it had internal gills, which mean it could live both on land and in water. Now the next question is, what are the body changes that underlie these transformations? In other words, what is the physiology or the biochemical mechanisms involved here? Now, to answer this question, we have to venture right into the heart of the cell where one of the chemical wonders resides, and that is the DNA molecule. DNA consists of segments called genes. There are about more than 20,000 functional genes in the human genome. And these genes can work together. They possess the information how to sculpt a nail, how to fashion heart muscle, how to produce bone, and so on. In other words, it specifies the features of the animal and hence determining its species type. Whether you are going to be a human, a chimp, a plant, or even a banana. All these genes together possess the information how to construct a human being or a creature from scratch. Now, if DNA, according to this understanding, is the master plan which dictates what the design of the animal should be, then changing the DNA sequence may modify the design of the animal. And this brings me to my next point, mutations. Now, mutations are local chemical changes in the DNA. And we know that they happen because they happen all the time. We can identify them and we can even date them. Now, most of these mutations are harmful. They produce misfits. But occasionally, a mutation arises which benefit the animal. Say if it could make the animal run faster, and this altered gene ends up in the sex cells, it may result in offspring which has a better chance of survival, and such offspring will become the dominant species. Now, the point I want to make is that if these changes, which we call mutations, can alter the genetic sequence, it could potentially modify the animal. So over a few generations, such mutations are imperceptible because, as I said earlier, evolution happens over vast spans of time. It then becomes conceivable that a series of related mutations over hundreds of thousands of years can bring about more significant changes, forming a nail, a wing, or a limb, and eventually give rise to a new species. So it is the accumulation of beneficial mutations associated with progressive improvements over geological time that underlies such drastic changes, such as fish turning into amphibians, some amphibians turning into reptiles, and so on.